Hello and welcome to Supposedly Fun. My name is Greg and I'm here today to do a Friday Reads video where I wrap up the week in reading and talk about any bookish things that have happened this week and sometimes non-bookish things. If you don't want the chatty portion at the beginning of the Friday Reads, there will be a timestamp in the description box down below. You can use that to skip to the Friday Reads portion. I'm going to try to be a little quick as we do the chatty portion this week. That never works out for me. Every time I say I want to do something quickly, I end up talking for like 10 minutes. It's just the way I am. The first thing I wanted to mention before we get to the Friday Reads, I finished 3 books this week, actually, because I finished a third this morning. But the first thing I wanted to mention is a shout out to my t-shirt. I am wearing this Guinness t-shirt that I got at the Guinness Storehouse when Joel and I were in Dublin. This is in honor of my very first baby, my dog named Guinness. Wednesday of this week marked 2 years since we had to say goodbye to him, so I wanted to wear this in honor of him. It's been a week, as you can imagine. Just we've both been in our feels about that, and Guinness was my first baby, will always be. It's 2 years later, it's still very hard, and I just wanted to wear this shirt in honor of him. Teddy has been very helpful navigating all the tricky feelings that have gone on this week. I wanted to try to get him into this video, but it's been a day. So Joel took him on an adventure earlier today to run a bunch of errands and do some stuff. And I was actually going to film my Friday Reads video while they were out of the house, but work happened in that work way. Make a plan and then work will come up with something that you need to do like immediately. So I didn't actually get to start filming, and they're actually home now. Joel's in his office working, and Teddy is passed out on the couch. He really had fun on this adventure that they had. So I figured I would not bother him and just let him sleep, and I'll get him back in another video sometime soon. But I had posted about the anniversary of Guinness on Instagram and got a lot of love and support. So thank you for everyone for that. Thank you for the birthday wishes. I mentioned there was some confusion about what day my birthday was. So my birthday was Saturday last week. And just thank you for all of the kind birthday wishes. I fell behind and didn't manage to get back to a lot of the comments, but I saw a lot of birthday wishes. So thank you. That does mean a lot to me. The only other thing, something I actually just saw this morning, and it was kind of nice to have a quieter book week, because last week when I did my Friday Reads, we were reeling from the Women's Prize reaction, and now we have like a bit of a lull before we jump back into things at the end of July with the Booker Prize, so we can enjoy a bit of a rest before we dive back in. But this morning, I saw an announcement that James by Percival Everett is going to be adapted into a movie. Amblin Entertainment, which is Steven Spielberg's production company, announced that they have secured the rights, and I believe Steven Spielberg is going to be acting as an executive producer on they don't specifically say movie. I'm assuming it's going to be a movie, and part of me is even hesitant to talk about. Actually, it does say for film right there in the headline of this article that I'm looking at. But I'm almost hesitant to talk about movie deals, because when it is announced that something is going to be adapted, the pre-production process can take a long time. Things can happen. It can get really complicated. It could take years for a project to come to fruition, if it does at all. I'm willing to bet, though, that whatever production process James has, it will probably be fast-tracked and we'll see something soon. And that is for a couple of things. Percival Everett is a very popular author right now, and James is one of the biggest critical successes of the year, and it's a best-selling book. It's one of the biggest sellers of the year, probably. I haven't looked at numbers to verify that, but it feels kind of right. And there has also now been a proven track record of adapting Percival Everett's books into movies, because American Fiction was released last year based on Percival Everett's book Erasure, and that was a great movie and got a lot of great feedback, a lot of success. Jeffrey Wright was nominated for Best Actor. It was nominated for Best Picture. Sterling K. Brown was nominated for Best Supporting Actor. I believe it won Best Adapted Screenplay in a very competitive year for that category. So I don't think it would be surprising if this kind of fast tracks its ways into whatever form it's going to take. I'm assuming that they're going to stick with the idea of a film. It would be kind of interesting if they would do a limited series instead, because limited series seems to be the way a lot of things go these days. And the episodic structure of Huckleberry Finn and James, because it's inspired by Huckleberry Finn, almost naturally lends itself to a limited series. However, I think they could definitely do a movie and stick to that. So it'll be interesting to see what happens. I tried to think about dream casting, and I don't have any ideas. I'm now at the age where all of the actors that I'm most familiar with are over 40. So I don't feel like I have anyone in mind. If you have someone that you would love to see cast as James, let me know in the comment section down below. It does say in this article from Book Riot that I will link down below that Percival Everett will write the screenplay, and right now Taika Waititi is in early talks to direct the film, which is an interesting pairing. I haven't seen a lot of movies by Taika Waititi. The only ones I've seen are the Thor movies that he has done right before I burned out on Marvel. So I'm not entirely familiar with his work, but he is an Oscar winner. He won an Oscar for the screenplay of Jojo Rabbit, which he also starred and directed in, but I haven't seen that movie. So I don't really know if that's a good fit for the material or not. Seems like it could be. But again, it seems like there are a lot of different ways that you could go with an adaptation of James. So first things first, I wanted to open by saying that that is a thing that is out there in the world and probably going to be coming to theaters soon. Or maybe if they take a hard pivot, maybe coming to your TV at some point in the future. And with that, let's just pivot to the Friday Reads portion of the video, because like I said, I finished 3 books and I'm in the process of choosing my next reads, because I finished 2 of the books last night. I'm filming this on Friday, and I finished 2 of the books Thursday afternoon and Thursday night. And I finished one this morning. I started and finished it. We'll get to that. It's a short book, so it was easy to do in that time period. But let's dive in. So the first book that I finished was The Guncle Abroad by Stephen Rowley. Now buckle up, because I feel like I'm going to complain about this book a lot, but I really want to stress I actually like this book. I did enjoy it. If you have read and enjoyed The Guncle by Stephen Rowley, I think it is worth your time to read The Guncle Abroad. I wouldn't just read The Guncle and stop. But I do think you should know that it might not be as satisfying of an experience as The Guncle. And it has a couple of complaints. I have some issues with some of the things about the book. However, I really enjoyed it. So this is going to be that weird thing where I liked something, but I'm about to complain a lot about it. I can feel that ready to happen. Moving back for a moment, let's talk about The Guncle, because that's obviously where all of this starts. And I fully admit, when this book was released, I saw it popping up a lot on Instagram, and the title and the cover of the book, I'm not proud of this, kind of made me say, oh, that just looks like a kind of fluffy thing. I don't feel like I need to really engage with that. By the way, if you're unfamiliar, Guncle, gay uncle. So you have this man in a caftan drinking a martini by a pool with 2 children and a dog in what is clearly coded as Palm Springs, and it is Palm Springs. So it's Patrick, that's the man in the caftan. And one of the things, like, he's dropped caftans completely. At one point later on in the book, it mentions, oh, I used to be really into caftans. And it just kind of feels weird. It's like, I guess it's a Palm Springs thing he leaves behind. But anyway, so he is an actor, but he hasn't really acted in a long time. He was on a TV show that is sort of coded as Friends, but obviously isn't. And the show is off the air. He's living off of the residuals, and he has gotten a house in Palm Springs, and he's isolated himself. He's losing touch with all of his friends. He's losing touch with his family. He's sort of just has this house in Palm Springs, and he's built a moat around it and pulled up the drawbridge and has pushed everyone else out. And then the world intrudes. His niece and nephew, Grant and Maisie, need to come stay with him for a while. Their mother has recently died after an illness, and Patrick's brother, who is also named Greg, very good name, needs to go to rehab, because in the process of losing his wife, he became hooked on painkillers. So he needs to go to rehab, and he asks Patrick if he will watch the kids. And this is an intrusion for a couple of reasons. One, because Patrick has never really wanted to be a father. His life is not conducive to being a father or having kids around at all. So it's an intrusion because suddenly this man who's never wanted to be a father is forced to be a father figure to two kids. And it's an intrusion because he has really done a lot of work to push the rest of the world out. And here are these kids who don't care about your rules and your boundaries. They're just there needing attention. And they are dealing with grief. This is a very difficult time for them. They've really recently lost their mother when this book is set. And in taking care of the children, Patrick has to help them navigate their own grief. And in helping them do that, he ends up realizing that he had bottled up a lot of things that he was dealing with. And, he thought he had stored them neatly away in his soul somewhere and just put them away in the dark recesses and didn't need to think about them anymore. And through the course of getting to know Grant and Maisie, he is forced to reckon with them. And the reason I'm really harping on the plot of the Guncle is that it feels like Stephen Rowley felt like he needed to duplicate the premise of the Guncle a little bit too much when he decided to do a sequel and wrote The Guncle Abroad. Because right there in that setup, you have Patrick assuming care of his niece and nephew, helping them navigate something difficult that they are going through, and in the process, helping heal something in himself that he had been trying not to deal with and hadn't even really realized was a problem. That setup is almost exactly duplicated in The Guncle Abroad, and I don't think Stephen Rowley needed to do that. That's my first minor little complaint about this book. I don't think you needed to mirror The Guncle in making The Guncle Abroad. Their relationship has progressed for about 5 years because, it's been about 5 years or a couple of years since this was published. I don't know if it's exactly 5 years, but 5 years has passed. The relationship is something different. It's hard to talk about this book without spoiling some of the things that happen at the end of the Guncle as well. I will try not to do that. But, some of the things that were set up at the end of this have even ended themselves. So at the beginning, Patrick is in London. Well, it opens with a scene that's going to happen later in the book where the rehearsal dinner for his brother's wedding has been a disaster, and then it flashes back, and Patrick is in London where he's filming a movie. And he sort of needs to come to the rescue of his brother again because his brother Greg is engaged and getting married. And Maisie and Grant are feeling conflicted about that. So Patrick decides to step in and step up again and tells his brother, listen, I'll take the kids on a European adventure. You go to Lake Como because the wedding is going to happen in Lake Como. Livia, Greg's fiance, is Italian. She's a Marchesa, so she's very, very fancy. And this is going to be a very, very fancy wedding on Lake Como. So Patrick says, just send the kids to London where I am. We will go on a European adventure before we get to Lake Como, and then everything will be fine once we get there. So it's sort of setting up this same situation where Patrick steps in to be the caregiver for Maisie and Grant, and in helping them navigate this difficult situation where they feel a little resentful about their father remarrying, he's going to end up learning things about himself and fixing things that he hadn't even realized that he was doing. Yeah, I feel like that's the part of the book you ultimately didn't really need. So they go on this European adventure. They do. And I actually got a copy of this book for free from Putnam, which is the publisher. And it came with this little map. So it starts in London and it hits all of the little destinations that they go to in Europe. And as much as I enjoyed the travel portion of this, just because there's so much great chemistry between Patrick and the kids, it feels unnecessary, ultimately. It feels like in that portion of the book, which is half the book, halfway through the book, they get to Lake Como. It feels like it's spinning its wheels in this sort of European adventure part of the book, because ultimately the book doesn't really start until they get to Lake Como. That's where all of the conflicts are. That's where Greg is. That's where Livia is. That's where Patrick's sister Clara meets them in Europe. That's where you have Paulmina, the lesbian aunt, or soon-to-be lesbian aunt of Maisie and Grant. So Livia has a sister named Paulmina who is a lesbian. So there's a Lant in the picture suddenly, and Patrick has to deal with feelings of jealousy and concern that this lesbian aunt is going to steal some of his thunder in his relationship that he has with Maisie and Grant. But all of that starts with Lake Como, and it takes half the book to get there. And again, that sounds like a huge complaint, and it is, really, because I think there's a structural problem right at the center of this book. However, I don't mind it because Patrick is still a lot of fun. His relationship with Maisie and Grant is still fun, and you can kind of effortlessly read them having adventures and trading barbs back and forth, and all of the wordplay and all of that is still fun. It's still delightful. But in trying to mimic the setup of the Guncle, it felt like it added this hurdle that doesn't really need to be there, because it feels like it's trying to make sure that Patrick has time to be alone with the kids in order to mimic the Guncle, and you didn't need that. He could have just met them in Lake Como and the plot could have started. And then it also would have made a little more sense, because then we would understand some of these dynamics a little bit more about, like, how long have Greg and Livia been dating? How well does everybody know her? Because all of those things are complete unknowns for the first half of the book. So you're sort of left wondering, like, well, how out of the blue is this? How fast is this all happening? And here's another thing that sounds like a big complaint, but I think it works because Stephen Rowley is a good writer and because these characters are so great. This definitely feels like a book that wouldn't exist if people sat down and had an honest conversation at the beginning. So if Greg and Livia sat down with Maisie and Grant at the beginning of the book and talked about, hey, we're getting married. I know that's probably difficult for you. How are you feeling about this? How can we make this easy for everybody? If that conversation had happened at the beginning of the book, there would be no plot at all. And that is a problem, I think. But because the adventure is fun enough and funny enough and amusing enough, it can kind of get away with it. But it is another kind of central flaw to the book. And the way it goes about, so you kind of are so desperate, again, to mimic the Guncle that you have Patrick deciding, I'm going to teach the kids a lesson, and I'm going to teach them about love. Oddly, again, instead of having Maisie and Grant meet him in London and sitting them down and saying, all right, so your father's getting remarried. How are you feeling about this? He just decides, they tell him they're not feeling great about it. And he just decides, all right, well, I'm going to teach you about love. Teddy just walked in. I don't know if you heard it, but it's like, I'm going to teach you about love, and I'm going to teach you about the love languages. And by the time we get to Lake Como, you are going to be happy that your father is getting married again. Well, that's not how kids work. So they get to Lake Como, the kids are still conflicted about it. But it just feels like you're trying to force this Guncle setup again. And it's just bizarre, because I feel like any rational person reading this book would be like, just talk to the kids. Just talk to them. And talk about what they're afraid of. You know, all this stuff doesn't need to happen in order to get there. And tied into that, so obviously in the Guncle, Patrick is rich. I think what makes that work is that you have the kids coming into his world and puncturing all of his extravagances, puncturing all of his big kind of fussy predilections about the way things are supposed to be. So it doesn't feel like the Guncle has a problem with privilege, because it's sort of making fun of the level of privilege that Patrick has. And The Guncle Abroad loses that completely. This is a book that feels like privileged people problems to a degree. And part of that as well is because the setup in The Guncle feels more compelling, because what Maisie and Grant are going through is not something everybody goes through, or a lot of people go through. Obviously it happens, and it does happen to a fair amount of people, but it's compelling. You have these two kids who just lost their mother and need to learn to navigate their grief and grow up, and that's going to be difficult for them. I mean, I've just talked about how it was difficult for me to have the anniversary of 2 years of losing Guinness. Like, that is an interesting premise. I think it doesn't work as well when the central conflict is something that feels almost mundane because so many people go through it, which is the concept of a parent remarrying. It happened to me twice. Both of my parents are married to someone else at this point. And, you know, it feels commonplace, and it makes it feel like this whole setup is a little bit overblown, because again, all you really had to do was sit down with Maisie and Grant and talk to them about, what are you feeling? What are your fears? That would go along. It wouldn't fix anything, but just hopefully, I think a conversation would have gone a long way toward not making this book not a thing. And it's just more concerned with having kind of comical mishaps along the way, rather than having open, honest dialogue between people, which doesn't feel right. And again, your parent remarrying is something that a lot of people go through. And a lot of the time, your concerns about your parent remarrying are ultimately selfish. There are circumstances where somebody remarries someone they shouldn't, or the dynamic that a new person brings into the family is toxic. So there are circumstances where there would be legitimate concerns. But, in this world, that's not really going to be it. And I don't feel like that's a spoiler. What Maisie and Grant are going through here is super relatable. And what's going through here is like, okay, listen, sit down and talk to them, help them understand, and give them time and space. Like, with all these hoops people are jumping through to try to accommodate Maisie and Grant starts to seem like a little much, especially with the level of privilege that is going on here. Like, Patrick is rich. Now Greg is marrying a Marchesa. So there's a lot of wealth going around. And, taking kids to fancy museums and fancy dinners and to get the fanciest hot chocolate in Paris starts to seem like a lot. And then going to this ridiculously extravagant wedding that most people can't afford, it starts to feel like this book has a problem with privilege that it is not really able to acknowledge. It has this huge blind spot where it's kind of like, this starts to feel like rich people problems. Whereas people who can't afford getaways to Lake Como or to send their kids on European adventures to try to calm them down before their wedding, those of us can't really relate to this level of extravagance and trying to solve problems by throwing money at them. So it is that. And the other little detail, and again, I just feel like I need to stop and remind everyone at this point, I did like this book. I did enjoy it, but I have so many little issues with it that were surprising and a little disappointing. And ultimately, I did like it, but here we go. So the next one is that you have the situation with the lesbian aunt. The way the dynamic plays out between Patrick and Palmina feels gross. So I don't want to take a deep dive into queer cultural history, but there has been hostility between gay men and lesbians in the past, especially in the 90s. Like, I was young in the 90s, but my father was already out of the closet and had a lot of gay friends. And the way they would talk about lesbians was they just didn't like them. And it relied on a lot of stereotypes and was kind of mean-spirited. And hopefully we as a society have moved past that and have done away with a lot of the stereotypes and done away with a lot of the siloing, like gay men don't mix with lesbians and things like that. It was kind of ridiculous always in the first place. However, Patrick's dislike for Palmina feels like it conjures a lot of those demons from the past. And I don't think I'm alone in feeling that, because I talked to Joel, who had read this before me, about it, and he had picked up on the same thing. I talked to Kurt Anderson, who is a commenter, and actually I think Kurt brought it up before I did, that it really, something about their dynamic felt kind of embedded in toxic ways of thinking about a dynamic between a gay man and a lesbian from the past. And it does feel like at one point an editor must have said to Stephen Rowley, like, you need to have Patrick make it clear that he likes lesbians, because all of a sudden he randomly has a speech at one point about, oh, lesbians are great. They were like caregivers for people who were dying of AIDS and blah, 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 blah. And it feels like an editor just kind of told him, you need to try to tone this down and make it clear that Patrick likes lesbians. And the dynamic feels off in this contest between the Guncle and the Lant, when ultimately, again, it's really not a big deal. So, and it's just interesting that it called back to this old toxicity that I really hope we have done away with from the past. And the only other thing I would say about this book is that even though I do still like it overall, and I would still recommend it to you, I think it's a fun summer read. I kind of hated the ending. Actually, wait. Let me not say I hated something, because I have learned recently people get very offended if I use the word hated. It's a little strong anyway. So, and yeah, anyway, we don't need to get into that. But I have learned people really get upset with me if I use the word hate. So let me not say that. I disliked the ending. And again, it's fine. The book overall is fine. I can't talk about it because it would spoil the entire book. But I really didn't like the way things played out. I didn't think it was necessary. And it kind of ties back to some of the things I've already kind of talked about. But overall, I did like the book. So I'm kind of in that weird situation. Again, I feel like this happens to me every once in a while, where I did like a book. I would still recommend it. But my adoration for the Guncle is unqualified. I think this is a great book. I think, I feel ashamed a little bit that when I first saw this online, I kind of thought, that just looks really fluffy and I don't need to prioritize that. It's actually a very good book and has really great relationships at the heart of it. And I can still recommend the Guncle abroad, but don't go in expecting the level of quality that is in the Guncle, because it feels a lot. My adoration for this one is a lot more qualified. And there are some things that could be an annoyance. I'd say run out and read the Guncle. Get to the Guncle abroad when you have time. If you are going on your own trip, this would be a great summer read. And there you go. I hope that makes sense. So let's hope I haven't angered people too much by talking about something I don't like. That's not even true. I did like it. I just didn't like the ending. Anyway, the next book that I finished was In Tongues by Thomas Grattan. And I really liked this book a lot. And I think it does a lot of really smart and nuanced things. This is a book that is actually a kind of fun summer read, but you could also read in fall or winter or anytime. But if you're looking for a queer summer read that is a little bit salacious, a little bit mean, but also fun and nuanced and sad and has real heft and emotional resonance to it, In Tongues would be a great book for you to pick up. So let me just add to the comment about salaciousness. If spice level is a concern for you, the spice level is a bit high in this book. But the premise is you have this man named Gordon. He is in his early 20s in 2001, when the majority of this book is set. That sort of 1 year period from 2001 into 2002. And Gordon has been in a relationship with a man named Alan, and Alan dumps him. Gordon is prone to performative feats of outrage, performative bouts of self-pity that come from an actual damaged place within him. He's kind of trying, he is aware of the damage and the hurt that he is carrying with him, but he doesn't really know what to do with it, and it comes out in these ways. And he does worry a lot that he behaves selfishly, and he wonders, is that just who I am? Can I fix that? So it's about early adulthood and somebody kind of finding their way in the world and finding their way toward maybe healing from their weird childhood. So his performative bit of outrage after the breakup is to steal money from Alan, pack up his suitcases, and go to the bus station. And at the bus station, they ask where he wants a ticket. And he says the first place that comes to mind, New York City. So he goes to New York City, and he's lost a bit at first, but rather quickly falls into the orbit of a lesbian bartender named Janice, who sort of takes him under her wing. She gives him a place to live in her apartment outside of the awful cheap apartment that he had found. She helps him get a job through her girlfriend as a dog walker. And he quickly falls into the orbit of Philip and Nicola. They are a gay couple. Philip owns an art gallery. Nicola works at the art gallery. Gordon quickly becomes entwined in the lives of Philip and Nicola. And if I have small complaints about this book, one of them is that the book kind of depends on Janice immediately finding Gordon so appealing that they fall into this life-changing friendship for both of them. And to the point where she almost immediately invites him to live in her apartment. She helps him find a job and blah, 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 blah. And the same thing happens with Philip. Nicola's immediate interest in Gordon is pretty easily explained because it's a lot more based on sexual attraction and flirtation. Philip's is a little more nuanced. With Philip and Janice, you don't quite see the appeal. Like, what is it about Gordon that immediately makes this tough bartender say, you need help, I'm going to help you, and we're going to be best friends, and our lives are going to be, we're going to be kind of like almost inseparable friends, and I'm going to be jealous if you aren't spending time with me. Like, what about Gordon sparks that kind of response? What about Gordon sparks so much interest in Philip that they end up hiring him as a personal assistant? That's not a spoiler. It happens like almost immediately in the book. He very quickly moves from Minneapolis to New York City, where he gets a job in a Foodland grocery store, and then very quickly moves to being a dog walker, and then very quickly moves to being personal assistant to Philip and Nicola. That's all like 20 to 30 pages in the book. You just don't quite see what it is about Gordon that inspires this level of interest. However, it's a really interesting and nuanced book, as I said, because Gordon has these complex relationships with his parents. His mother is very distant, very logical and practical. And those are qualities that don't necessarily lend themselves to ideas of maternal love. And he doesn't really feel rejected by her, but he also doesn't really feel adored by her. And he's kind of accepted at this point that that's just not the type of relationship that they have. He's never going to get that sort of satisfaction of feeling loved from his mother. And then his father is this loving man who may have some kind of mental or emotional imbalance, because he feels like he suffers from bouts of depression that he doesn't really know what to do with. And of course, it's undiagnosed. And almost paralyzing, crippling fear and confusion, and he's unable to hold down a job. And ultimately, he turns to religion. And he loves his son, but he also, obviously, because of the extreme religious angle that he latches onto, he also is compelled to reject his son because his son is gay. And it's this really interesting relationship, and you can see both Gordon and his father have something in common, which is that they both feel empty, and that emptiness scares them, and they don't know what to do with it. They don't know how to live a life and be a quote-unquote normal person. And his father fills that emptiness with religion. And Gordon he sees that as a sort of unhealthy reaction, and I think it's kind of clear that in his father's case, at least, it is an unhealthy reaction. Like, he's trying to fill himself with something else and kind of running from his actual problems. Not that that is the case with everyone. Religion can be fine. Everybody's allowed to do their own thing. But in this case, like I said, they both just have this emptiness, and that is how his father has tried to fill the emptiness. And it creates this dynamic where his father will send him emails and he doesn't know what to do with these emails. And it's a really interesting relationship that develops. And then you have this twisted relationship with Philip that is kind of paternal, but also potentially sexual. And it plays out in really interesting ways. And I don't want to get too much into where it all spins out, but obviously it's messy because Gordon is a messy person. He makes a lot of bad decisions. He kind of intentionally blows things up sometimes. And then he's also a young person who has been damaged and is trying to find footing in the world and trying to decide what he wants to be. His ending up in this art world, this sort of elite art world, is interesting because he comes from a very lower economic ladder, or rung on the ladder. And anyone, I think, can relate to the feeling of being out of place and trying to find your footing and trying to find out what the rules of a game are that nobody has laid out. You know, I think if you have worked in the corporate world, there are a lot of unspoken rules that go into corporate environments, and the way you are expected to behave, the way you are, you know, your job description might say one thing, but the expectations might actually be something else. And a lot of times it's not necessarily about the work you do, it's about the social game you play. Like, each corporate environment is different, but I'm just kind of using that as an example because I think we have all been in circumstances where we don't know what the rules are, but we're trying to figure them out as we go. And that is kind of Gordon in this environment that he ends up in as Philip and Nicola's assistant, because there are all these wealthy people, and every time he has an interaction, and part of it is his age and insecurities that he has, he's always second guessing, like, was that the right thing to say? Did I make this person mad? Have I ruined everything just by making one little throwaway comment? And part of that really does come down to him not knowing the rules of the game that these incredibly wealthy people play by, and the expectations that they have, and how to make them happy and keep them happy. And it's just a really interesting, cool book. So I'd say if you're looking for summer reading that's a little salacious, very easy to read, but and a little sometimes mean, but also extremely empathetic. Sean the Bookmaniac, Sean Breathes Books, did an interview with Thomas Grattan. I'll link it down below. That was really interesting. And it's interesting in a lot of ways. But one of the things I found interesting is that it talks a lot about Gordon being an unlikable character. And he is in some ways. But it's what I came away from is an overwhelming compassion for, or empathy at least, maybe not compassion, but empathy for Gordon and the things that he's going through and the things he's struggling with. And it allows him to be that complicated character who can be unlikable, do unlikable things, but is also hurt and damaged and trying to find a way. And I thought that was really nuanced and cool. And I think there are a lot of really sharp observations in the book about life. And I have two as an example from early on in the book. The first one is, Nicholas saw the flowers and coffee and looked at me like I was a precious mineral. I wanted to be that. Wanted to, not to need his look to authenticate my value, which is something I think it's just a very sharp observation. And then here, where he talks about his relationship with his father, as someone who has a complicated relationship with his father, it really kind of hit home. There was no single event to point to, no hinge between before and after, though when I tell people about him, it's sometimes easiest to cite the accident or his unswerving devotion to the Lord rather than what was truer, that like an artery's blockage, our end was an accumulation. Skip a couple of lines. But there was no easy answer to give. I could tell her that my father confounded me, that in moments I'd loved him with a fierceness my young self didn't know what to do with, that I'd been ashamed of him with that same wildfire, and learned early how loving someone meant to also see the ways they were pathetic and small. And this book is filled with lines and passages like that. If this wasn't a library book, I would have taken out a note card and just, written them all down. I didn't see the point of noting them all down just to return this book to the library. But this is a book that is filled with observations like that even if you don't agree with, they are interesting. And I would recommend In Tongues to you, with much less qualification than I did The Guncle Abroad. I thought this was a very sharp, interesting book that reads really quickly, but also kind of similar to Tin Man, has the tone and feel of loneliness pervading it. That is kind of the feeling of the book as you read it. And that's really interesting. And I just thought this was a great reading experience. So I recommend In Tongues by Thomas Grattan. Not everybody is going to like it because, again, Gordon can be unlikable. There are some mean-spirited things that happen in the book, and ways people behave can be a little confounding. And it's that same way of sometimes when you are depressed, you don't always act in your own best interest and you don't make the best decisions. And it's really interesting. So this morning, I picked up an audiobook that actually had been recommended by Kurt Anderson, who I mentioned earlier. It is called Homebody by Theo. I'm blanking on Theo's last name. It is Theo Parrish. This is actually a graphic memoir, and they did an audiobook, and I was a little uncertain how that would work, but Kurt Anderson said the audio has really great production value, and it really does. Sometimes a character will be walking and you can hear footsteps, or you can hear leaves rustling. It's a really beautiful way of putting together an audiobook. It's also extremely short. So I don't know how many pages are in the graphic memoir, but the audiobook is 1 hour and 3 minutes. And a lot of the time I listen to audiobooks at 1.2 speed. I don't really like to go faster than that, but it sort of feels like at 1.0, a lot of times the narrator talks so slowly that it no longer feels like talking. So at 1.2, it actually feels like a normal or average speaking pace. And at 1.2, I think it ends up being about a 50-minute book. So you could do this easily. I actually started it this morning as I was getting my day going and going into other things, and I was done before I even knew it. And it's really good. If you have read Genderqueer by Maya Kobabe, it's sort of in that wheelhouse because it is a memoir of growing up and not feeling like you fit into the traditional binary of, man or woman. Because growing up, Theo can't quite understand where they fit in all of these dynamics. And then they hear about transgender, but it doesn't seem to fit who they are. And then they see the word non-binary and immediately start to think that I suddenly make sense to myself. And it's about that process of discovery. And it's really beautiful and sweet. And even if you have known someone who has been on that journey before, I think it's well worth your time. Again, this is such a short book that honestly, I would say for Pride Month, do me a favor and listen to Homebody or read the graphic memoir, because it's about compassion and understanding, and even the ways in which, as Theo comes out as non-binary and transitions to like they, them pronouns, they feel like they have inconvenienced other people by being alive and having an identity. And I've seen that happen. Like, I know someone who came out as transgender, and in the early days, if somebody used their original name, or their dead name, or used the wrong gender, as the person apologized, my friend would immediately jump in to make the other person feel better and say, no, I understand. It's a confusing thing. I don't care. But it matters. It really matters. So you see that same sense of trying to make other people more comfortable and taking on the pain kind of plays out. And Theo Parrish sort of has a bit of a reckoning with that. And I just think it's so interesting. And I would say it's important for a lot of people to read. It's an hour of your time. So I would really highly recommend Homebody. Perfect read for Pride Month or beyond, because Pride reading doesn't stop with the end of June, which is coming fairly quickly. So I am in the process of deciding what my next reading will be. I realized I actually have a copy of The Safe Keep by Yael van der Wooden on audio. So I might do this as my next audiobook. I haven't really committed yet. I think I'm going to wait until I actually start something. And I've done really badly with listening to audiobooks lately. So we'll see. I might not actually start something until Monday, and because I'm such a mood reader, I'm gonna wait until I'm actually gonna start something to decide. But The Safe Keep is kind of where I'm thinking I will go next. And then I have this pile of books that I am thinking about. I'm doing my mood reader thing where I've compiled a pile of things that four of which are on my pile of possibilities for Pride Month, which will be linked down below, and one of which is a library book that I had recently learned about and would fit with my Pride reading. So I'm not even going to show them to you. I'm just going to kind of tease and let you guess what is on this pile of books, because I'm going to sit down, and when I'm actually going to read, for sure, I'm going to sit with this and go with what speaks to me the most. I think I know which one it's going to be, but we'll find out. That's it for this long Friday Reads, as I'm looking at the timestamp for the time on my phone, which I'm recording from. So if you're still here, thank you. I'd love to hear what you've been reading and doing and all of that stuff in the comment section down below. As always, I really appreciate your time, especially if you're still here. And I will be back. Until next time, happy reading. And by the way, Teddy has been snoring. So if you hear snores, it was him. Bye.